Hi, and welcome to Inver Hills Community College. Today we have our 6th annual Marijuana Forum. I'm Chris Engelhardt, and I'll be one of your MCs today.
I'm Megan Muckenhern, and I'm also the other MC. So today's speakers are Megan Thompson, who is the Operations Supervisor of the Office of Medical Cannabis from the Minnesota Department of Health. We have Gunnar Ose, who is the Secretary Sensible from Minnesota, which is a nonprofit corporation that promotes the expansion of medical cannabis in Minnesota. We have Pat Bradley, who is the Deputy Director of Minnesota NORML, which is the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and Tim Davis, who is the co-founder of the Minnesota Grassroots Party.
So our speakers format is going to be like this. Each speaker will have a maximum of 10 minutes to present their ideas. If a speaker gets within 1 minute of the 10-minute limit, the timekeepers will hold up a 1-minute remaining sign. Then, if needed, the 30 seconds remaining sign. And then, finally, the stop sign. After that, we will move on to our next speaker. As the speaker presents, please write down your questions and pass them down on your note cards on your chair, and pass them down to the nearest usher. And that's how questions will be asked today. We won't take any direct questions from the audience.
All right, so our first speaker today is Megan Thompson.
Thank you for having me out here today. It's a nice warm spring day, so it was nice to get out of the office. And what I plan on presenting to you today is basically a broad overview of Minnesota's medical cannabis program. Next slide. So you may be aware that in 2014, legislation was passed in the state of Minnesota, and in May of 2014, Governor Dayton passed into law Minnesota's medical cannabis program. At that time, Minnesota was the 22nd state in the nation to pass a full medical cannabis law. And you can see on the map that there's other states that have also passed full medical cannabis laws. There's some that have already gone recreational, and then there's some states that what we call have a CBD program. So they're not a full medical cannabis program. For example, they allow CBD, but they do not allow the THC, which is the psychoactive part of the cannabis product. So Minnesota was the 22nd state to go with a full medical program. Next slide. So we do like to let everybody know that according to federal law, our program is illegal. We'd like to think that it's unlikely that the feds would come in at any time and shut down our program, but technically, according to federal law, they could do that. Medical cannabis is still illegal at the federal level. Therefore, our program is completely a voluntary program, whether you're a healthcare practitioner that certifies patients for the program, or the patients or the caregivers that are in the program. It's completely voluntary. So there's a couple of things that sets Minnesota's program apart from other medical cannabis programs in the country. One of the most notable is that Minnesota's program does not allow for the smokable form of medical cannabis. Most states do. There are a few others that I think came around after Minnesota's program that have continued in the same vein. Which are, I think, New York is one, perhaps Pennsylvania, but most states allow for the smokable form. Minnesota does not. I've been told that part of that was a negotiation during the time that the legislation was being written. It was a way to get some people to buy into the program being launched. The other thing that's very notable about Minnesota's program, and I'm actually not aware of any other state's program that has this required in their law, is that our state, under our statute, is actually required to learn from program participants. So if you're in the medical cannabis program here in the state of Minnesota, whenever you go in to pick up your medical cannabis at a cannabis patient center, you have to first complete a survey. And the survey asks basic questions because we want to learn how the medical cannabis is actually working for the patients and whether or not they're receiving benefit. And a little bit later in my presentation, I'll show you some graphics about how patients and their healthcare practitioners have reported benefits into the program. So there is no other state in the country that actually is conducting studies that are based on law in the program to learn from the program and its participants. So Minnesota, originally we only allowed for 9 qualifying conditions, and the 9 that were first allowed are typically what we call the worst of the worst: ALS, cancer, muscle spasms. In 2016, the Commissioner of Health passed what we call intractable pain. It's similar to chronic pain, except for with intractable pain, patients have to have tried multiple treatment modalities in order to say that, yes, their pain is intractable and it's not going to go away. I would say 60 or 60+% of the participants in our program actually suffer from intractable pain. It is the largest condition in Minnesota's program. Next slide. So I mentioned intractable pain being added in 2016. In 2017, which was last summer, the Commissioner of Health decided to add PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. In about a year's worth of time, PTSD has actually become the 3rd highest certified condition in our program, and it's almost neck and neck with muscle spasms. So it's working its way to being one of the highest certified conditions in our program. So you can see, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, intractable pain at almost 70% of the patients in our program. Then at 15%, it's muscle spasms. So if you think of like multiple sclerosis, people a lot of times will have muscle spasms if they have a lot of pain, they've been in car accidents and the like. And then closely following that is PTSD. And then the other conditions come in at much smaller amounts. Now the age distribution has also changed over time. We've noticed that when intractable pain became a condition, an approved condition in 2016, we actually started to see that the program participants started to get a little bit older, and it also switched to having a little more females in the program than males. So we kind of wonder if we have a lot of baby boomer women that are starting to sign up for the program when intractable pain became approved. Then you can see the next graph shows how our patient population has grown. In the first year of the program with the 9 qualifying conditions, it was a slow uptick. It went a little bit higher in 2016 when intractable pain was added. And we've actually noticed over the last 6 months or so that the program is steadily increasing. And it's actually all conditions are continuing to sign up for the program. So in the state of Minnesota, the statutes allow us to have up to 2 medical cannabis manufacturers. We have Minnesota Medical Solutions, which is based out of Otsego, Minnesota, and we have Leafline Laboratories, and they're based out of Cottage Grove. They actually grow the plants in their state-of-the-art greenhouses. They do the drying, they do all of the shredding, and then they extract it into an oil form, and then they actually do science where they create it into a liquid form. As I mentioned earlier, the smokable form is not allowed in the state of Minnesota, so it has to be made into a pill, an oral solution. It can be made into a concentrated oil for vaping purposes, but no plant product is allowed. At the cannabis patient centers, most states call them dispensaries. In Minnesota, we call them cannabis patient centers. That's where they sell and dispense the medical cannabis in the liquid forms. And a little different tidbit about Minnesota is that it's actually dispensed by pharmacists. In other states, they may be called bud tenders. In Minnesota, you actually have to be a registered pharmacist in order to dispense medical cannabis. So the manufacturers are responsible for all of the drying and the harvesting of the product. In Minnesota, we allow for CO2 extraction, so we do not do butane extraction. You think of, you may have heard on the news sometimes when people try to make the highly concentrated oils, they'll use butane, and then you have the likelihood for explosion. In Minnesota, we only allow currently for the CO2 extraction. And then our manufacturers also have laboratories where they then turn it into pills and tinctures and oral solutions. Then we require third-party testing. Minnesota's program ensures, it's in the statute, that the manufacturers have to have the products tested. We have a lot of patients that are in our program that have immunocompromised conditions, and so any type of mold or pesticides in their products could make them extremely sick. So all the product is tested. So I mentioned earlier how we like to learn from Minnesota's program. We send out survey results and we compile them. So that's a different part of Minnesota's program. You can see from a couple of graphics where I'll end here is that most patients have reported significant benefit from their medical cannabis. The next slide is from healthcare practitioners. They're a little more cautious, but they also have shown benefit in their product. And then my last couple of slides are just some actual quotes that patients have written in on their surveys on whether or not they've benefited or not benefited in participating in Minnesota's program. So thank you for having me here today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. And on to our next speaker, Gunnar Oos.
Hey everybody. So in these type of things, before I get started, I'd like to ask that we take a quick moment of silence for people who have been victimized by the war on drugs. This is everybody who, from people who have died or had a reduced quality of life due to not being able to access medical cannabis, to people who have been incarcerated for years, if not their whole lives, to also people who have been killed by police, gangs, or drug cartels at home and abroad. So just ask that we take a moment here. Thank you. So yeah, like we said, my name is Gunnar Oos. I work for Sensible Minnesota. We are a nonprofit organization which is working to represent and advocate for medical cannabis patients in the state of Minnesota. In addition to that, I also work for an organization called Students for Sensible Drug Policy, also known as SSDP, which is the largest grassroots movement of young people working to end the war on drugs. We're active on over 350 campuses in 28 countries now. So I kind of have experience working in both the cannabis side of advocacy as well as the larger issue of drug policy. So I'd like to start off by talking a little bit about what Sensible Minnesota does. So like I said, we advocate for medical cannabis patients. A big part of that is our patient advocacy program. Our program in Minnesota is a little bit confusing and hard for patients to navigate, especially because there are, certain doctors or certain hospitals that will not give you a recommendation to access your medicine in the state. So we work as kind of a liaison between patients and the program to help them navigate it and answer any questions and deal with any issues as they arise. In addition to that, one of the things we do is work with the Office of Medical Cannabis and their petitioning program to get additional qualifying conditions approved for the program, as well as additional delivery methods. We wrote the petition for PTSD to be approved as a qualifying condition, and we're working on even more this year because we believe that cannabis is a medicine, and we want anyone who would have their life improved by having access to medical cannabis to be able to do that. In addition to this, we work on educating the public and lawmakers about, the benefits and the safety of cannabis, as well as the harms done by prohibition. Happening right now, actually, at the state capitol, we're having the first ever vigil for victims of prohibition, where we've collected a bunch of stories from patients across the state, and are sharing their experiences with legislators and with the public. Let's see. That being said, Minnesota's program is not perfect. We are much more expensive than many other states, and the limitations in the statutes that prevent additional manufacturers or additional patient centers means that, especially for low-income and rural Minnesotans, medical cannabis is very inaccessible. That's one of the reasons that we are working to, within the program to expand it, but also to build what is sometimes called recreational program, although I prefer the term adult use program. I believe that cannabis is a medicine even if you don't have a debilitating condition. There are many people that experience health benefits, and if an adult wishes to try to see if it's right for them, we don't believe that the law should be getting in the way of that. So that is another thing that we're working with. Let's see. After adult use legalization happens, though, I like to keep it in mind of everybody that the drug war is still not over. We still have a opiate epidemic in this country that is taking 60,000 lives a year, especially the lives of young people. And that isn't going to stop with legalized cannabis. And it is a direct consequence of drugs being illegal. There's this concept called harm reduction, which believes that there are strategies, laws, and programs that we can put into place that help reduce the harms of drug use. The biggest harm out there is prohibition. It's drugs being illegal and impure and hard to access. It's money going to criminal organizations that kill people to mark their turf. I envision a world, and SSDP envisions a world, where there is a legal market, where the manufacturers and the distributors of products are held accountable to sell a clean product to people, to do it safely, and to have that money reinvested into our communities. So that's something that, if you take away anything today, I wish that you take this away, that the war on drugs is real, and that we need to organize and fight back, and that a better world is possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunnar. So now we're going to move to Pat Bradley.
Good afternoon. Small point of order, I'm vice chair, not deputy director. That's just a typo. What he said, to start there, happy 420. And I look around the room, and only a few of you were old enough to know when this mess began. And I was there when Mr. Nixon did what Mr. Nixon did, ignored the Schaefer report, and arbitrarily put cannabis on Schedule 1. Today, Senator Chuck Schumer announced that he's going to introduce legislation to take it out of Schedule 1, arbitrarily. And why not? It never belonged there in the first place. No medical evidence, no science evidence, nothing. The power of propaganda and the willingness to use, various laws to, no other way to put it, put people down, especially if you're the wrong color or the wrong type. So if you missed Mr. Haldeman's quote from the Nixon tapes, they were after black people and hippies, and they didn't use that language, right? It still goes on that way. Hennepin County has a 9-to-1 ratio of arrests for cannabis. That's right here. That's ridiculous. Yeah, it makes no sense. Minnesota NORML's mission statement is to repeal Minnesota's cannabis prohibition laws so that responsible uses of cannabis by adults are no longer subject to penalty. Personal freedom, you should be able to do what you want. We don't have any problems with regulated markets. We do think any laws we pass have to legalize home grow. You should be able to do this yourself if you want to. No different than raising any other plant crop. We've also cut ourselves out for years from the other benefits of the other forms of the plant, one of which is hemp. And industrial hemp was a really big deal where I grew up. During World War II, we lost access to fiber from the Philippines. We immediately suspended all of our laws at the time to say we can't have anything cannabis-like, and we started growing hemp like crazy. And the phrase Iowa ditchweed comes from the stuff that got out of the fields and into the ditches. It won't do you any good to ingest it because it doesn't have any of the good stuff in it. It's not a psychoactive. However, it looks the same on the outside, and therein is where we've run into for industrial hemp. So we're advocates for all uses of this very, very utilitarian plant that is amongst the oldest plants we have cultivated in human history, at least 12,000 years ago. At least. Think about that for a little bit. In only very recent times, thanks to basically some party poopers and racists, we're where we are. It makes no sense, and we'd like to end it as soon as possible. So I won't use my entire time. I encourage any questions you might have, and thanks for having me.
Thanks, Pat Bradley. On to our last speaker, Tim Davis.
Hello, and thanks to Dave Berger and the Emerald Grove Community College for inviting us here today in this 6th annual Marijuana Forum. I'm Tim Davis, and I, like Pat, was around in the 70s, and that's how I got active. The 70s were a time that, much like today, had a lot of young people. The Vietnam War was going on. Martin Luther King, of course, was killed in '68, 50 years ago. We had a Democratic convention with riots and the Yippies in '68, and in 1970, Nixon. And I have the quote that Pat talked about, that John Ehrlichman said that Nixon said, and I'll read it to you. The Nixon campaign in '68, then the White House after that, had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. And at that time in the 60s, there was a lot of racism, and which there still is, and of course riots when Martin Luther King died, and as well as the upset with the Democratic Convention and the Yippies. So much like today's Republicans, they don't like people who all disagree with them. Well, they said that they couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. They realized that the Constitution kept them from doing that. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Based on lies, racism, and the general ignorance of the public, most substances have been made illegal. And it goes back way before marijuana. It goes back to opium smoking by the Chinese, which we brought over here to build the railroads, much like the black people, which we brought over here to grow our crops in the South. We brought the Chinese in the West. Well, they had opium, and they smoked opium. We could smoke opium today, too, but our troops are guarding it over in Afghanistan. We have an opioid crisis, or so they say. There's not an opioid crisis. There is no opioid crisis when you tell doctors not to prescribe opiates. What we have is the failure of the DARE program and of the drug education programs that started back in the war on drugs era of the Reagan administration, the Just Say No. That's why we have these people who are doing drugs and think that they're perfectly fine because they're prescribed by the doctors. And then when the doctors cut them off, they have no supply. They go to the streets, and which, as we know from Tom Petty and Prince, they find evidence of drugs that look alike, but they have things like fentanyl in them, which causes them death. What we really have is a problem which has been discussed here, prohibition. I helped form the Grassroots Party back in the 80s. I first ran for office in 1988 for state representative. It's now known by the Legal Marijuana Now Party as they have progressed. But we basically did the thing that has to be done in this state is take the politics to the people. Because Minnesota is not a state where we can just go to the people and say, we would like to legalize marijuana and put it on the ballot. We're not an initiative state. So we do not have the power of the initiative in this state. So in order for us to put the question of do Minnesotans think marijuana should be legal onto the ballot, we must do it through the legislature. It either has to come from the legislature, it has to be put on the ballot as a constitutional amendment, as was gay marriage, or it has to be done through the legislative process, and the governor has to sign the law into law. So therefore, there are limits to what we can do here in Minnesota. We have to become politically active. Right now, as has been mentioned, there are things going on at the Capitol, this being 420. They've had 420 celebrations, meetings with their representatives. People who are there can go meet the representatives, talk to them about how important this issue is. Prohibition is, of course, the most dangerous in a free country. You're not free in this country. If you're free, let's go smoke a joint. You're not free, plain, pure, and simple. And anyone who thinks they're free is lying and kidding you. There has been things going forward, such as Pat mentioned with hemp. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has fast-tracked the hemp bill that he is behind because of Kentucky. And Kentucky was one of the states that grew hemp quite largely in the World War II era, as did Minnesota. Minnesota had hemp farms and hemp processing plants in southern Minnesota, one of the biggest states next door. Wisconsin also grew hemp during World War II. So there are a lot of things going on. I would encourage all of you to get active in one group or another. I know I've given money to both of these groups. Normal, I'm a member of Normal, have been a member of Normal since the 70s, and Sensible, Minnesota, and have supported their work as well. There are many actions that we can take, many activities that you can do. Get your friends, your neighbors, your mom, your dad. One of the biggest growth industries in cannabis right now is senior citizens. So your mom and dad may remember when they did it and maybe said, maybe now's the time to take it up again. But I would suggest any questions you may have, just go ahead and jot them down, and I'm sure most of us would be happy to answer them. But look forward to more happening in this area because we're not giving up.
Thank you, Tim. All right, so now we're going to move on to the second half of this form, which is the question and answer session. So each audience member has 3 note cards, so you can write down questions for the speakers. You can ask a question to all of them, 1 or 2 of them. All questions must be written on the note cards. We will not be taking any direct questions from the audience. Once you fill out a note card, please hand it to one of our friendly ushers, and then Christopher and I will ask the questions to our speakers, and then each speaker has a maximum of 3 minutes to respond to a question. So the timekeepers will hold up a 1-minute remains card, 30-second remains, and a stop card as needed. So the first question we have is...
The first question we have is for everyone, starting from right to left, so starting with Megan. Do you believe cannabis is a safer alternative for the treatment of pain? Will fully legalizing decrease the opioid
Opioid.
abuse and addiction?
I will say that the survey data that we've collected from patients, we've had patients that have expressed to us that they have reduced or lessened the opioids that they are on for intractable pain. It does seem to work well for some people and not as well for others. So I think one thing we've learned about cannabis is that it works differently for everybody. But our initial survey results are showing that there is benefit in reduction of opioid medicine.
Yeah, so the science really clearly shows that places where individuals do have access to cannabis have lesser rates of opioid abuse and opioid addiction. However, I think that there is kind of a narrative within the drug policy community that if we legalize marijuana, that the opioid crisis is going to go away. And I strongly disagree with that sentiment. I strongly disagree with the idea that we can legalize and take away people's opiates and there's not going to be a problem there. I believe that, for things like treating pain, that decision should be between a person and their doctor, and that for people struggling with addiction, that there are services that we can put out there that will help address the problem additionally. That includes things like safe consumption spaces, like increased accessibility for medicine-assisted treatment, and eventually the legalization of heroin, I think, is very important too. So that it's a complicated question, but yeah.
I guess I'd echo that. It is a complicated question. The good news is cannabis doesn't have a fatal dose, at least not one that anybody's found. If you haven't heard it before, there's a test for various chemicals called an LD50 lethal dose for half your animal sample. We don't have an LD50 for cannabis. We do for everything else that we take, from alcohol on down. They're in different form. They work differently in the body. Cannabis works in a completely different part of our system than the opioids do. So there are complementary aspects to them, and it's just another tool in the toolbox for the medical community when they're trying to treat somebody's pain. But it's not a panacea, but it shouldn't be prohibited either. The prohibition is the harm, and it does do many, many people quite a lot of good without it. Tim?
I would tend to agree. From the studies, it seems that there, from what I've read, 25% less use of opioids in the states that have legalized marijuana for use. That's why we need to legalize all natural substances grown from the ground. Opium, coca, mushrooms, and marijuana should be legal. There's no reason why any state should have a law that says something that comes from the ground is illegal for you to use. That's just ridiculous on its face. But if you're going to eliminate an addiction substance like opium or heroin or the opioids, you must give these people something to alleviate their pain. We don't have the opioid crisis. As I said, we have a pain problem in the United States. We do not know how to administer pain relief to people who have pain. And then they become addicted. And then we say, oh, you're addicted, so let's put you in jail. A great place. No. We need to do like Portugal. Decriminalize all personal use amounts of everything. And if you need to use heroin or crack or whatever, there is a place where you can safely do it, where you can get help if you want it, and you know what you're doing. You know exactly what you're taking. And there is someone there who is watching you, who can give it to you, who knows that it's not laced with fentanyl, who knows it's going to do you what you expect it to do. People use drugs because they work.
So this question is directed to Megan Thompson. So Minnesota is the only state losing money in medical cannabis. How do you think we can change Minnesota's marijuana program to make money?
I think a couple of the speakers have mentioned that our laws are created by our legislature. So I think what would need to be done to change the current legislation would be for all of you to speak with your legislators and encourage them to actually change the laws that are in place currently.
If I may, we have a shot. Tony Cornish isn't there anymore.
All right, thank you. All right, so this one's for Gunnar. So after years of anti-drug rhetoric and programs like DARE, what kind of cultural shift would be necessary for the legalization of cannabis to gain more traction?
Right. So one of the things that Students for Sensible Drug Policy does is we've developed this curriculum called the Just Say No Drug Education Program, and that's no with a KN. It's evidence-based, science-based, and non-judgmental drug education that gives people a space to talk about their experiences and to ask open questions without, worrying about the police breaking into their house in the middle of the night and shooting their dog. I think that education on that front is incredibly important with changing attitudes and reducing harms. As for legalization too, I think that the more people know, the more people will realize that this drug war is stupid, pointless, expensive, and does not accomplish a single thing. So yeah, I would say that the education front is incredibly important. There's a really cool article that was published in Teen Vogue yesterday about this program being rolled out in New York. I would definitely recommend checking it out. It's later reading material.
Thank you.
So this next question is for Pat Bradley. What would you say to the people who believe marijuana is a gateway to hardcore drugs?
They're wrong. Bring some evidence that might even remotely be true. I guess under the heading of that, by that logic, so is milk and so is air. But there's no evidence that I've seen presented anywhere that there is such a thing as a gateway drug to another one. Most people, go back to sayings from when I was in college, some people can't handle their drugs, some people can, some people need to find their drug of choice and reject the others. But as far as a gateway thing, no, that's made up of whole cloth.
I might add that I think the gateway theory, which it is a theory, started based on the lies that they told about marijuana in the first place. Because you see, if you've never done a drug and you do it and you expect what they tell you happens to not happen and it doesn't, then you have a different way of looking at things. If you watched Reefer Madness and thought you were going stark raving mad and kill people, and you smoked a joint and you didn't feel that way, you would say, somebody lied to me. So maybe they lied to me about coke too, or heroin, or methamphetamine, or something else, and you started to do those too. That's where they get the gateway theory from, because they lied to you at the beginning, and you assumed that everything else was going to be just as benign as marijuana. And it doesn't happen to be that way.
And I would add into that as well that
I'm sorry, we have to interrupt. Each question is for the person designated.
Yeah, I'm
Otherwise,
sorry.
we're not gonna have the same time for each person. We can't do that. I'm sorry, guys. IHCC is,
That was
please
my
enforce
fault.
that from now on.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
My bad.
All right, so this question's for Tim. So what are the future goals of your political party, and has it changed names recently?
From the Grassroots Party to legal marijuana now, the same people generally running it. And again, it's based It's rather based on what people want. It's, would you rather vote for a name or something that says legal marijuana now? And that was the thought in the name change, was that when you get on the ballot, you have a name next to your name and it says legal marijuana now. If that's what you want, you vote for these people because that's what they stand for. Grassroots Party was basically the same thing. It was started because, as Dr. Grimmer, one of our first candidates for Attorney General in 1986, stated that once the people were educated, they would come around and realize that what we said about him and marijuana was a lie, and they would stand up and want the truth. Well, that didn't happen, obviously. But it was started from, hopefully, the grassroots of the people would rise up and demand a change once they saw that the drug war was taking the lives and costing them lots of money.
Thank you.
On to our next question for all of our speakers, starting with Megan. Does cannabis have different effects on kids and teenagers compared to adults?
My understanding from research is that there can be impacts to the developing brains of pediatric and young adults. My understanding is that the manufacturers that participate in our state's program definitely will recommend products that are higher in the CBD form of medical cannabis versus the THC, the psychoactive effect. There's a lot of benefit to the CBD part of the plant. It has anti-inflammatory tendencies, and typically they'll try to start out with a high CBD formulation of the product for pediatric and young adults.
I feel like there's kind of two ways to look at this question. There is the medical side of it, and I would agree with everything that you just said. As far as the harms of cannabis are way less than the harms of a lot of the other medications that would be prescribed to young children that are using medical cannabis. As for recreational, there is evidence out there that does say that starting to smoke weed too young isn't great for your brain. I wish I had waited a couple of years before I started personally. But that is one of the things that, legalization solves. Drug dealers don't check ID. Legal marijuana dispensaries do. And I think that's a very important thing to consider. Is, if you want kids to not be smoking so much weed, legalize it.
I would concur. There is some scant evidence that THC and early brain development may not be the greatest thing on the planet, but we don't know to what degree that is. And we're in that conundrum, that lovely catch-22 of we need to study that more, but we can't study that more because it's not legal. But we need to study it more so we know, and round we go. But again, we are consumer advocates for cannabis for adult use, and absolutely concur that the black market never checks ID. White markets do.
A recent study said that cannabis exposure is not associated with residual adverse impact on cognition between older and younger people. So if you're worried about that, that doesn't seem to be the problem. The question is, what is too young? There has been this debate among people who want 21 to be an age for adults. I am disagreeing with that. I think 18 should be the age. Actually, I think lower, but I think if you're willing to join this country's military and kill people in foreign lands, you should be able to smoke a joint. You should also be able to drink a beer and do anything that an adult does. If you're picking up arms to defend this country against foreign enemies, made up or real, you should be able to be an adult. If
Thank
you made
you.
that decision goes for everything.
Or perhaps we raise the age for killing people.
perhaps.
You do a question. Yeah, do that. Do that one.
All right, so this one's for Pat. Why do you feel cannabis is still highly restricted in today's society?
Propaganda works, essentially. We've been propagandized since the 30s. Tim mentioned reefer madness. There was a whole round of propaganda that went with Harry Anslinger's and William Randolph Hearst's efforts, and again, made up out of whole cloth. There wasn't a lick of truth to any of it. There was no science, there was no anything. We're just going to work on your fears. And propaganda works. Put some money behind it, propagandize. Watch and listen to what's going on right now today. There's a lot of propaganda. But it has long tails. There's an awful lot of people got exposed to it when they were young. They are still with us, and they still believe it, even though it is not true. Wasn't true then, isn't true now. But essentially, propaganda works.
Thank you, Pat. And on to our next question, directed for Tim Davis. Who does it really benefit to keep marijuana illegal? Private prisons, the government, citizens? Are there any benefits
Keeping it illegal?
to keeping it illegal? Yes.
Well, for the people that it benefits, sure, obviously. There are 5 major corporations, large institutions that fight legalization. One of them, the alcohol industry, because they don't want, obviously, competition. The police, oh, yeah, the police. If you ever think that the police are your friends, they are not your friends. I have a book that you could read. It's Our Enemies in Blue. Political power, politics in America. It's about the police. And if you read that, I think you'll come away with a whole different idea of what the police are in America. But the prison industry, as we know, we have private prisons in this country, and some of those prisons have made deals with the state that if you don't keep the prisons full, then we'll have to shut down, and then, you're going to have to release prisoners, and we'll be out of jobs. The alcohol industry, the police industry, and of course our big buddies, Big Pharma, they sure as hell don't want drugs to interfere with their take of the money. As a matter of fact, we can look at a company called Insys, INSYS. They gave $500,000 to stop a marijuana initiative in Arizona, and yet their owner, their CEO, was busted for advocating fentanyl to doctors, and they just received the okay from the FDA for synthetic marijuana. Synthetic marijuana is not real marijuana. And why did they want to introduce synthetic marijuana? Because real marijuana would have been their competition. And so they had to go out and give money so that they would stop legal marijuana so that they could get synthetic marijuana okayed. Big Pharma is the problem. Big Pharma is the problem with opioids. Big Pharma is the problem in America. There are only 2 nations in the world, United States and New Zealand, who can advertise the drugs that we see every day on our television, radio. And half of these things you think, my God, these people are crazy. Because if you take them, you're going to commit suicide or get sick anyway. So there's a big problem that we're not addressing in this country with the legal drugs, not even talking about the illegal drugs.
Thank you. All right, so the next question is from Megan. So is there anything preventing patients from lying on their surveys? And if so, do you count such things on the statistics?
The surveys are patient-reported information, so technically they could lie if they chose to. We wouldn't be able to tell whether or not they lied on their surveys. They get surveys at a 3-month period of time, 6-month period of time, and then whenever they go in to pick up their medical cannabis, they complete a survey at that time as well. We do encourage patients, and I believe the manufacturers do as well, that it benefits them and it benefits the program if they're honest and that we can actually learn from the program, and that would then require them to be as honest as possible. But no, there's nothing that forces them to be honest to participate.
Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Our next question directed to Gunnar Oos. How would prisons be affected if cannabis was made legal in the state of Minnesota? So would legalizing all drugs solve everything?
Okay, so there would definitely be less people in prison, which I think is a good thing. Not just people in prison, but people who have that status as someone who's been incarcerated following them around the rest of their lives. I think that, as a society, our goals should be to have as few people incarcerated as possible and to not have those people going back into prison. We really need to start focusing more on rehabilitation and helping people build the skills that they need to participate within the social contract. So, I think that it is definitely a step in the right direction to end the drug war and start making changes in our prison system. California was great about, removing people's records after they legalized, and last year that happened. And it's all part of the puzzle. Legalizing all drugs is part of ending the system of mass incarceration. Not the whole thing, but it's a big part of it.
All right, so this one's for Pat. How do you think the state would be affected if we legalized recreational marijuana?
We'd make a lot more money, to start one thing. We'd have less people in jail. And we would take away an obviously racist tool from racists. Because the way our drug laws are applied is absolutely as racist as how they were invented in the first place. Go back to that first reference to opium. The first drug laws in this country, and every drug law since, was aimed at somebody, some group of people who were out of favor. It has ever been thus, and it remains that way. Repeat myself with the disparity in Hennepin County for the arrest rates between people of color and white people for this substance. Makes no sense unless you go, oh, there must be something else going on here. And it may well be racist. If you haven't already read the new Jim Crow, I encourage you to go find a copy and give it a good read. It is outstanding.
Thank you, Pat.
All right, so this one's for Tim. What do you think about gabapentin being tracked the same way as opioids?
About what? What is it?
Gabapentin?
Gabapentin?
Gabapentin.
Gabapentin? I've never heard of it, but it's a drug.
Gabapentin? Gabapentin.
Okay, and should it be, what is it? Should it be
Tracked the same way as opioids?
Should it be tracked? Is it? I would think that if it's a drug that comes from pharmacies, it's already tracked. It should be tracked. There are things, and I know that everyone's, well, not everyone. So let's say the propaganda out there right now is concentrated on the opioid epidemic, but there are other problems with other substances. This may be one of them. Also with the drugs that are like Xanax classifications. They're having problems with those. The same thing can be said for a lot of the diagnosis that you're given, such as ADHD and those kind of things, that they give you Ritalins and other drugs that are like amphetamines that really are made up by the pharmacies. They're made up diagnoses. They really don't exist in real life. But, so I would think that if it's a drug, yeah, it should be tracked at least, know what's going on with it. Although I've never heard of it though, so is it any good?
All right, our next question directed to all of our speakers. What do you think about the concept of drug use going down when a drug is legalized because it has lost its dangerous, deviant allure? Starting with Megan.
I think it's a very real thing. I think that does happen. For myself personally, I started smoking when I was a teenager, and I think it was because it was something that you weren't supposed to do. I smoked for nicotine cigarettes, and it took me years to be able to quit. I mean, I probably smoked for about 12 years, and it was very difficult to quit. I think there's some research that shows with nicotine that if you don't start smoking until you're after 18 years of age, you're significantly less likely to start smoking. So I think that's would probably apply to a lot of drugs and not just the cigarettes.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a good hypothesis. I don't know that I've ever seen any evidence that supports it other than circumstantial evidence. But I do think that the legalization of drugs allows people to do the drugs that they want to do rather than what's available for them. So I think that does have an impact on lowering overall drug use when you're looking at certain categories and drug classes.
Yeah, it's a nice premise. It may be true. There's a little bit of evidence out of Colorado that there was a slight dip in underage use once it was legalized. Whether you can attribute that to the fact that it's no longer, wrong or bad, or your parents aren't going to lose their heads over it, I don't know. It seems to be primarily anecdotal at this point, but perhaps, maybe.
Well, the real question is, why are we worried about it? Why should we be concerned if it's legal? Obviously, it didn't do a darn thing with alcohol. There's a lot of people who drink alcohol now, even though it was prohibited many years ago. We learned from alcohol prohibition that didn't work, and we should be learning that drug prohibition doesn't work either. These things are moral decisions trying to legislate morality, which never works. It's never worked throughout history. But yeah, there's going to be probably people that say it's legal. It's like alcohol. It's legal. Do you have to go out and drink? No. But if you want a beer, you know where to go get it, or a bottle of whiskey. And it's the same thing with pot or anything else. If you wanted it, you know where to go get it, and you know what you were buying.
Thank you.
Okay, so this one's for Megan. What would you consider a negative reaction to medical cannabis?
Well, I think what we've heard from patients about our program specifically, and it was a question that was raised earlier, is actually the current cost of medical cannabis in the state of Minnesota is high compared to other states. It could be for a variety of different reasons. One is, as I stated during my presentation, our program does not allow for the smokable form. And when you have to involve all the science and extracting it and making it into liquids and different formulations, that it costs more money. To require all the laboratory testing to make sure it's safe, that costs money. Because of that, it's more expensive in Minnesota than it is in other states. Our current law, our statute, only allows for 2 medical cannabis manufacturers in the state of Minnesota, so there might be not enough competition as there is in other states, and when there isn't competition, then you don't have anything bringing down the prices. So I would say probably the number one thing that we hear in our program is the cost of making the medicine for the patients. In regards to like health consequences, both of our manufacturers are required to have programs for tracking of serious adverse events, and both of them actually contract with a national company called Safety Call. It's a 1-800 number where patients can call in and report any significant health events. And to date, my understanding is we've had 2, and our program launched in July of 2015. And the 2 serious adverse events were cyclical vomiting syndrome. And apparently the patient would start extreme vomiting, they cannot stop, they get dehydrated, they ended up having to go to the hospital to get IV fluids. And my understanding is that's just something that they're unfortunately people that can no longer imbibe in medical cannabis. But those are the 2 serious adverse events that we've heard of.
Thank you, Megan. Our next question is directed to Pat. The question goes like this. What can Minnesota do better on the medical cannabis program?
Not my subject area. What Megan said, lowering costs would be the number one complaint that we hear about. And we hear about it as a, do you know anybody who can help with that? You know, kind of on the sly, is there another way or a less expensive way? And that would be illegal. We don't do anything like that. So cost seems to be the biggest issue with the current Minnesota medical program.
So this one's for Gunnar. If you were to legalize all drugs, what would be an ideal minimum age be?
So I think that there's kind of a way of looking at this that, you know, first we need to have decriminalization. We need to stop putting people in jail and start treating it as a public health crisis before we start talking about full-scale legalization. If we're talking an age, I think that should be the age of adulthood, which 18 years old.
Thank you, Gunnar. Our next question directed to Tim. How do you feel about legalizing all drugs?
They should be legal. I feel that all drugs should be legal. There should be warning labels on all the drugs, and education. Education is the biggest failure, as I pointed out earlier. The opioid crisis is a good example of education failing, that we didn't educate, and I don't know, I mean, I didn't grow up. I mean, like I said, I've been active since the 70s, so we knew back then. I guess we had guys coming back from Vietnam, our friends, and who were shooting heroin and smoking the good reef back then. But we knew most of the dangers. If we didn't, we tried them. And I think that the education is what's lacking. And once the drugs are legal, as everyone here has basically said, that you will find your own. I mean, as I've said with alcohol, you may have gotten drunk once, and you may have not liked that feeling. So you may not be anxious to go get drunk again. It's the same thing with any drug. If you're going to use it, as the old way, it would be the drug set and setting, and depending on how you're using it. But if it disagrees with you, you sure as hell don't want to keep doing it. So I would think that all drugs should be legal. As I said, they should be first decriminalized, so you're not a criminal. You should have a safe supply, so you know what you're getting. It's not laced with fentanyl or some other drug. And have at it. If you can afford it and you can buy it, it's up to you. It's your choice.
Thank you. So this next question is directed at all of our speakers. So is there any evidence of marijuana killing brain cells? So we're going to start with Megan.
I'm not aware of any research that has shown that.
I second that. I've never heard of this happening. One thing that is interesting is your brain and your body has an endocannabinoid system. Your brain is, and your entire body is looking for the cannabinoids that are in cannabis. So I don't know, if our bodies are built that way, why is it looking for something that would kill us?
Yeah, it's not. No fatal dose, and the only thing I'm aware of that cannabis can kill in a petri dish is a cancer cell. There's fair amount of evidence for that, but not brain cells.
A DEA judge, Francis L. Young, in 1988, on a ruling, said that marijuana was theoretically the safest product known to man and can be used far safer than some of the vegetables we eat, safer than a potato. And it would take theoretically 1,500 pounds in 15 minutes if you were going to smoke it to kill yourself, which is impossible, physically impossible to do. As far as brain cells, I doubt. There are so many other things going on in the brain, and cells do die, and but marijuana, no.
Our next question, directed to Megan. How long does the average medical program participant stay in the program, or do they tend to leave after a length of time?
I'm not sure if we've specifically looked at that. The program does require an annual registration. So when someone signs up for the program, they are signed up for a year, and then they can decide at that time whether or not they want to renew. Our biggest enrollment period is during the summer months, because that's when the Commissioner of Health adds new conditions, and we definitely have an uptake in our business in August and September of every single year, because a lot of people do decide to re-enroll in the program. We have people that have been in the program since its inception, but we've also heard from some patients that it didn't benefit them. And if it doesn't benefit them, they do not have to re-enroll. It's a participatory program.
Thank you.
All right, so the next one's for Gunnar. Since THC stays in the blood for a long time, how do you regulate DUIs with marijuana?
Yeah, so there are field sobriety tests where you can tell if somebody is, under the influence. If somebody, smokes once and then 2 weeks later, they have a urinalysis and, there's THC in their body, that does not mean that they're still, under the influence of cannabis. I am confident that there will be, scientific breakthroughs that will come up with a way, of determining the last time that somebody consumed, but also like how much they consumed. Because there's a difference between, a patient taking their medical dose and, somebody eating a big, strong edible for the first time. One of those people, I think it's probably okay that they drive. The other person, they might want to stay home. So I think that's one of those things that, as we continue down this path of further legalization, something will be figured out.
Thank you. Our next question directed to Pat and Tim. If adult use of marijuana is made legal, won't drug dealers and gangs start pushing harder drugs? Starting with Pat.
Interesting concept. If it's legal, then you're no longer going to see your local drug dealer. And we'll go back to the gateway theory. The only thing that got missed in that when we addressed it the last time was, to the extent there was a gateway, the same guy that was selling you weed had all the other stuff, and you could sample his wares if you chose to. Legal basically takes that, breaks that relationship, so that probably goes by the wayside. Frankly, one of the great reasons to legalize all the drugs is to eliminate the illegal distribution network, which is only supported by a black market. When you make it a white market, it doesn't work that way.
I would agree. You control it. That's why drugs need to be legal, so that you can control, obviously, what goes into the substance itself. And again, I go back to what we had briefly touched on, the cost. You know, you can grow pot in your house, in your closet, in your bedroom. You know, if we could grow these things, we wouldn't have that need. You know, if you could grow your own medicine, you wouldn't have to go to the store and buy it. You can juice marijuana. You can put it in a juicer. You can drink it. You can eat it. You can, I mean, you know, it's a plant that has many hundreds of thousands of uses. So if it were legal, and all drugs were legal, and you wanted to do it, you could go and do it. I think that would be the way to go.
Thank you. All right, so this one's for all of our speakers. There are many physical benefits with the use of cannabis, but are there mental benefits with the use of cannabis? If so, what are they?
So I
think I will be the person.
I think what we've heard the most from the patients that have participated in our program and shared their stories with us is, and I think this is why when I was showing the slides earlier, that there's patients show greater benefits than what their healthcare practitioners are reporting. And I think that there's some benefits of cannabis that don't show up on your typical clinical test when you go in to see the doctor. And that's around quality of life. And that's typically what we hear most from our patients, as the medical cannabis has improved their overall quality of life. If they suffer from seizure disorders, they may still have seizures, but their overall quality of life has improved. We've also heard from patients that their sleep has significantly improved. So it's not just that their symptoms specific to their condition have improved, it's just that greater quality of life. They're more motivated to get up and play with their kids. They're more motivated to get up and go to work. They can actually have the first night of good sleep in years. So those are some benefits that aren't just, you know, physical benefits that a doctor would report.
Yeah, so earlier today I said that I don't like the term recreational marijuana. I prefer to use the term adult use. And that's because I think that, you know, there are benefits that is why people choose to smoke weed. You know, there are mental health benefits like, you know, calming and relaxation and peace of mind, and you know, these long list of you know, reasons that people would choose to consume cannabis. So I think that is, you know, it's a very holistic plant, and you know, mind, body, and spirit. It helps treat all of those things.
The Israelis who isolated the THC molecule many moons ago have indicated that our endocannabinoid system, it's entirely possible for many of us that cannabis is simply nothing much more than a vitamin that gets us to where everybody else might already be. And to make it a purely personal and anecdotal story, I have an ex-wife who tells me that cannabis makes me a much better human being than I would otherwise be.
What was the question? I'm
So-
listening to everybody else, and it's like, yeah, wow.
There are many physical benefits with the use of cannabis,
mental
but
benefits.
yeah, the mental.
Yes, and one of the reasons why the thought process to make it illegal was that you would open your eyes to the racism and the injustice of our capitalist political system. When you stop, if you're really stoned, sometimes you sit there and ponder things, and you might come to the realization that you live in a society that's not what it says it is. that it's hypocritical on its face, and that you may realize that you don't have to do what you think that they think you should do. And that may be just all right with you, but it's not all right with them. And that leads to problems. We're all born not knowing. We're all ignorant of something. I mean, I've asked the question before, did anyone here know you were going to be born? Then how do you know what you know now? Because you learned it. Somebody taught it to you. You learned it. You either learned it or you gave up on it. You thought it was no good, whatever. But you have that ability. And so when each and every single one of us, if we all smoked the joint, it would all affect us differently because we're all individual people. And each and every single one of us have our own individual likes and dislikes, and the way things affect us one way or the other is how we react. So I think, as I said before, everything should be legal. And if it affects your mind, it might affect it in a good way, and it might affect it in a bad way, but that's your mind, and that's for you to decide. And I think that Pat's wife should have just kept him stoned, and maybe he still been married. Who knows?
Our next question, again directed to all of our speakers. Starting with Megan, do you think cannabis can induce anxiety?
I think from what I'm aware of, everyone responds differently to cannabis, so that is a possibility. I think it's a very individual type of response.
You're stoned, and the cop was behind you.
So, let's see. So one of the reasons that anxiety is not a condition, a qualifying condition in Minnesota, is that there isn't medical literature out there that says that cannabis cures anxiety or treats anxiety. The research actually sometimes shows that, you know, it does have that negative effect. That being said, I know a lot of people who, you know, smoke weed to treat their anxiety conditions, their anxiety disorders. I think that, you know, it is that everybody is different, everybody's neurochemistry is different, and it's all about finding what is right for you. Not just if cannabis is right for you, but what cannabis is right for you. You know, that's one thing that I haven't heard mentioned yet today is that, yeah, even more than that, you know, every strain has its own, you know, terpene profile and, you know, its own chemical breakdown that's better for treating one condition or another. So I would say that, yes, you know, the wrong cannabis for the wrong person can induce anxiety.
Yeah, and anecdotally, I know people who take care of their own anxiety with cannabis, and I know people who are made more anxious if they use cannabis. And to them, we go, this is not your drug.
Not unless you want to be anxious. Yes, as I said, if you are stoned and a cop goes behind you, you probably get anxious. So it's. I agree with everything that's been said. It's, you know, as I said before, every one of us is different, and if it causes you anxiety, then, as Pat said, maybe it's not the drug for you. Maybe you can just pass. Maybe you can be designated driver.
All right, the next question is directed at Megan. So, are there different effects in smokable cannabis compared to non-smokable cannabis for medical use?
I actually think I would defer to the other panelists if they have information about that. I can't answer that.
Tim, you want to take it?
What's the question again? Is there differences?
Yeah, are there different effects of
Yes.
smokable versus non-smokable?
Yes. Yes, there are. Ask anybody who has an edible. Yes, very different. When you smoke, it goes directly into your lungs. If you eat it, It takes longer because your digestive system takes longer for it to get into your system, which is one of the reasons why they suggest if you are eating an edible, you do not eat a whole lot. Because that is the problem, is that people expect an immediate result and they don't get it. And so they eat another brownie and then eat another, they eat a little bit more of that cookie and they drink a little bit more of that. And the next thing they know, they're too far gone. And that's the problem, because it takes a while to get through your system. It's the way your system works. It's not the pot itself, but it depends on how you take it. It's just like shooting up is quicker than if you snort it, or well, not that way, but if you smoked it. So, yeah, there are differences when you eat it or when you smoke it, and different types. As we talked about, we didn't talk about indicas and sativas, and he was talking about the terpentones about each one. Each one is different, and if you go to a dispensary and you have different kinds, and they'll ask you, the bud tender or whatever, the pharmacist will ask you what your particular problem is, and if you need to sleep, you try this one. If you need to stay up and be alert, you may want to try this one, and that sort of thing.
Thank you. So this is our last question, and again for everyone, starting with Megan. What one message would you like to make sure everyone watching today comes away with from our program?
So the message that I would like to impart is, I've worked for this program since 2014, and I think what I've learned the most from the patients in our program is that you should really be grateful for the health that you have. My staff every day are on the phone with people that are helping them in the enrollment process and helping them obtain this medicine, and they like to tell us our stories. And a lot of them are in need and are suffering, and there's been many days where I know I personally have gone home and have felt very grateful for the health that I have. And I'm glad that our patients in the program have been able to at least have access to something that has been able to help them.
All right. So first off, if you're interested in learning more about the medical program in Minnesota, or you're interested in looking at becoming a patient, check out Sensible's website. It's sensible.mn. If you, after sitting here today or watching on TV, feel like you really want to make an impact and end the war on drugs, I would definitely recommend looking at some of the awesome organizations in the state and getting involved. And to the students in the room, if you're interested in joining Students for Sensible Drug Policy, talk to me after this. It's a really cool organization, and I would love to help you get involved. Yeah. The war on drugs is a war on us, and we need to end it together.
I'll do the rest of the pitch. mnnormal.org is where you find us. We have a member meeting tomorrow morning at O'Gara's, and we're at the Capitol until 8 p.m. tonight. You can join us for 4:20. And ultimately, it's long past time to end the war on drugs. We are $1.5 trillion into this exercise since 1970, since Nixon started it and Reagan bumped it up. And the addiction rate for our society is exactly the same as it was when they started. No impact whatsoever. It's a complete waste of money, and criminalizing personal behavior of this sort doesn't work. We have gobs of evidence to say that it does not work. It's nonsensical. It makes no economic sense. It makes no societal sense. So let's stop that, and join us or join whatever org is out there to help. But we're all working to get this done. Thank you very much.
And I would lastly say, if this is an issue you feel deeply about, get involved. I know that we've sat up here and told you that I've been involved since the 70s in one way or another, and these other people have been involved. Get involved. If not, there's normal you can join, sensible, the Students for Sensible Drug Policy. There should be a chapter here, for goodness sakes. You know, get involved with your legislators. You all have a representative you can write, and your senators, your state senator, get involved. Tell them this is an issue that you need. The election's coming up, 2018. We have governor candidates. You know, it's going to be a big election this year, and we're pushing to make sure that this is an issue. The Star Tribune said it's going to be an issue in the governor's race this year. So let's make it an issue. If this is an issue you want to get behind, get involved. And the more people, the more the merrier. It's you know, it would be one thing if it was just the four of us sitting here trying to do something. It takes a long time. But if everybody gets involved, it's a lot easier, and it's a lot more fun.
I might have buried the lead. Vote.
Yeah, vote.
Vote.
Get out. Get active. Register to vote. This is still a democracy. Well, not really, but you know, they claim it is.
One we could imagine.
Thank you. Let's give another round of applause for our speakers today.
To close off, I'd like to give a special thanks to our Inver Hills Department of Sociology, our Inver Hills Sociology Club, and Town Square Televisions, and also our speakers today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So we have an upcoming speaker forum this fall in 2018. It's our 5th annual Life Raft debate, which is when 5 professors come and debate their discipline on what they teach for the last spot in a life raft at the end of like.
So there's also going to be a devil's advocate at this forum. It's more of like a debate, and the devil's advocate would be debating against these professors why they shouldn't be on that last seat. So if the devil's advocate wins, then unfortunately all of the professors will die.
Theoretically, let's hope.
Metaphorically.
Yeah.
We'll find out. Come and find out.
Thank
Eventually,
you.
all of us will.
Right.
Thank you.
We got through a lot of questions. Awesome.
I have had this eyelash in my eye this entire time.